Welcome back to another episode of Just Mental. I'm your host, Kendall. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. Her name is Bella. She's a 28-year-old trans woman currently living in the state of Texas. Here at Just Mental, we are proud to offer a safe and inclusive space for those looking to share their stories. And with that said, Bella has decided to remain anonymous for the duration of her interview. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to Bella.
My name is Bella. I am a 28-year-old trans woman. I grew up in Southeast Texas in a very conservative house. I moved to Austin as soon as I could when I graduated high school. And then I went to UT here, started transitioning in my fourth year of college. I took some time. I had to withdraw from university and I took some time to myself to like figure out my transition. That was when I started doing sex work. And then I went back to UT to finish my degree. And then I continued doing sex work afterwards because it was lucrative. And with the advent of OnlyFans, I have turned to that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when everybody was home and horny and everything blew up. And so I have been focusing most of my efforts on OnlyFans for the past 3 years now. And I'm currently preparing to leave or flee the state in a couple months because I no longer feel safe in the state I grew up in.
You talk about growing up in a very conservative community. What was that like mentally for you?
I was very involved in the church. It was like my way of trying to like make my family proud, or my parents rather. And
Did you
so
feel
around
did you feel like they weren't proud of you as you were?
it's complicated. God, I've talked about this so much in therapy. I just for some reason from a very young age, I was like very my I the way that I like got like happiness and like a sense of self-worth was like my family being proud of me, and the things that I was good at was like school. I was very smart, and then also like church. Like I was very knowledgeable about the Bible. And because I knew that was like a way to make my family proud or make my parents proud of me, I was like all in on it. And then about 12 or 13 years old, I was like, I think I'm attracted to boys. And I literally shoved it to the very back recess of my brain. Like the kind of mental gymnastics I did is incredible. And then around like 10th grade, I think, I was like, okay, this isn't going away. I need to do something about it. And I was like, I'm going to go talk to my youth pastor. And so I did that. And then we came up with the whole pray away the gay thing. I did that for a year and a half. And then I think it was like towards Christmas of like my junior year of high school, I was like, this is not changing. Like, at no point in my life have I ever really been attracted to women. And so I like quietly accepted it. And I ended up moving out in with a different parent. I have my dad, or my mom and my stepdad, who I grew up with. And then I have my dad and my stepmom. And I moved in with them. And part of that was that they were supportive. And then that was when I came out like publicly. And yeah, that was like a precursor to me coming out as trans. Coming out as gay was a lot simpler. Sorry, does that answer your question?
It leads into my next question because I think it's still quite a new concept to talk about the idea of transitioning. So, can you tell us a bit more about what that process is like and what the moment was that you knew that maybe how you had been born wasn't the person or the body that you were meant to be in?
Yeah, so I know that the most common and like acceptable narrative is this one of, oh, I knew since I was like 3 years old or whatever. And I don't think that's necessarily accurate for everybody. It certainly was not accurate for me. Looking back on my childhood, I can see that I was like drawn to feminine things, but like femininity was very demonized in the house I grew up in. I'm trying like not to give too much identifying information, but I grew up in a Southern Baptist home, which is very fire and brimstone type. And so I was forced to have a buzz cut my entire childhood. My hair was kept very short. Anytime I like around like towards the end of middle school and like high school when I started trying to like develop my own sort of sense of style. Anything that was not like fucking, oh sorry, am I allowed to cuss on this? Are you gonna bleep
Yes,
me?
yes, you can swear.
Okay. I don't, a lot of the podcasts I listen to, they have to bleep everything and I feel bad for the editors.
No, it's all good.
Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah, as soon as I was like trying to express myself, anything that was not very rigidly like Wranglers and cowboy boots and yada, like my stepdad was like not happy about it. And my bio mom just went along with that, whatever he wanted. And it was like a struggle in a lot of in high school. And so as soon as I moved in with my bio dad and my stepmom, I started growing my hair out because I could. I started exploring myself more. And then once I got to college, so I have a pretty unique experience. So I went to UT, I joined a queer fraternity that was specifically for queer, which immediately gave me like a really great group of friends, but it also introduced me to drag. And I was immediately like drawn to it. And I spent probably 2 or 3 years expressing myself through drag, but also becoming more comfortable with like feminine aspects in my daily life. And after a while, I started realizing the kind of makeup that I was doing to perform was a little bit what they would call fishy drag, where it's more about being passable as a woman and less about, I don't know, do you know who Trixie Mattel is?
I do not.
Do you watch any, have you ever watched Drag Race?
I have watched RuPaul's a couple times.
Okay, so RuPaul is a little bit more on the fishy end of the spectrum, but on the other end of the spectrum is like extreme, like dramatic, like stage, almost like clown makeup. And so I gravitated towards the like fishy makeup, like stuff that I felt made me look more passable as a woman. And I started to realize throughout that I was a lot happier expressing myself and being perceived as a woman. And it took me some time to come to terms with that because obviously, like, it's a very big change. It's very different putting on this like costume and performing versus going about your day-to-day life and expecting people to call you a different name and use different pronouns and everything. But I just over those 3 years became more and more confident and like comfortable making the decision to transition, which I had been seeing a therapist already and talking about this. And when I decided I was ready to start hormone therapy, they gave me my letter. I think I got in right at the beginning of the informed consent model, where it's changed a lot just in my lifetime because previously doctors would be like, oh, you have to have 12 or 24 months of lived experience as your like desired gender. So they would force people to present as like female with no hormones for a year or two to prove that they were like about it, that it was like real for them. That sounds horrifying to me. So thankfully, I took my letter, went to my doc immediately, got hormones, started that in like November of 2015. Early 2016, I was like presenting as a woman, so like all the time, like day to day. Obviously, I didn't necessarily pass as a woman from the beginning, but that was when I started doing like laser hair removal, things like that, and growing my hair out even more, which thankfully I had already been growing. And then in May of 2016, I got my name and my gender marker changed. And so now everything all the way down to my birth certificate says female. And I remember at the time when I was doing it, I was like, this is not that difficult. Does Texas know that you can do this? Does the Texas government know that this is how this works? Like, I feel like we're just slipping under the radar. Like, one of these days, they're going to realize that we're allowed to change our documents and that's going to stop. And lo and behold, here we are.
When
Would
you,
you like me to continue?
yeah,
Oh, sorry.
sure. I was just gonna ask actually, when you said that last sentence, what exactly do you mean? Have the laws changed?
Yeah, this is something on my mind every single day. There is a massive wave of anti-trans legislation, particularly in Republican states. And we are just the next scapegoat. I remember when I was in high school, before the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage, like that was like the culture battle. And now it's trans people because we've gotten more acceptance. There's been this sort of like critical mass of trans people existing in public, with all of the like messiness that entails, because transitioning is not like always pretty or like a straight line. And anyway, the laws in several different states are changing. They started with this, it's, oh, we have to protect the kids, because what they do is they find like something that seems reasonable to like the average person. Protecting a child seems reasonable. And so they say, oh, we have to protect the kids. And now, like a child that has supportive parents can express their desire to transition. And that means different things at different stages of their life. But there's so much misinformation, and they just repeat this like talking. People are like doing surgery on children and like transing the children. And so then it becomes this, oh, they're grooming the children. And so now we're back to the same kind of rhetoric from like the 90s and the early 2000s, that like queer people are all pedos. Like it's not new, it's just recycled. And so then this is the reasoning that they use to pass laws against our community. And essentially it's become a, oh, we have to protect them from themselves type sentiment. And so in Texas right now, I think actually today, they're in the process of passing a bill that is going to ban trans healthcare for minors. So for anyone under 18, which, to be clear for the listeners, that transitioning as a child simply means changing your name and your presentation most of the time. Once you hit puberty, you're often given after, with like in conjunction with therapy and therapists, mental health professionals, are given the option to go on puberty blockers. Mind you, these are the same puberty blockers that have been given to children that develop precocious puberty for decades. Nobody had a problem with that. And so these children are given these puberty blockers, and it's like a pause button. And all medications, like some people are going to experience side effects. It's part of medicine, but it's not the majority by any stretch of the imagination. And then around 15 or 16, if they persist in their expression that they are trans, normally around 15 or 16, then they're giving cross-sex hormones. And so for someone who is transitioning from male to female, at that point, they're given estrogen and or progesterone. For someone transitioning from female to male, at that point that they're giving testosterone. There are cases of people having surgery under 18. Generally, the vast majority of them are 17. It's very exceedingly rare for anyone younger than that to have any kind of like transition related surgery younger than that. And the misinformation that's being pushed is that, oh, these people are grooming these children into being trans, and then they're having surgery on them, and then there's the whole pedo rhetoric. And so another example of legislation is in Texas right now. They are attempting to pass a bill that would effectively ban gender affirming healthcare and insurance coverage for transition related healthcare for adults. But they're doing it in such a way that they are skirting a constitutional challenge to it. So they're not outright banning it. What they're doing is they are forcing doctors to be liable in if any of their patients decide to detransition, which is very rare. They are forcing these doctors to be liable for any of the healthcare related with those people deciding to detransition. And because of that, these doctors are either not going to be able to afford their malpractice insurance, or they're going to be dropped by their malpractice insurance. And so they are effectively trying to ban healthcare for trans people. They're also, so far, they have banned anyone under the age of 18 from changing their documents to be updated. I'm pretty sure that bill passed in Texas, but there are so many others across the country in different states. There's these anti-drag bills that have passed that have such vague wording that it would essentially include trans people. So like in Tennessee, if I, as a trans woman, give a performance as like a street performer, like that goes against their anti-drag law because of the way of the wording is so vague. And Florida is gone the absolute hardest in the paint about it. And so I just feel like at this point, it's best for me to move to a state where I feel safe and protected, because there are states that have explicit protections for trans people and trans healthcare enshrined into the laws. And in those states, like, trans people aren't dominating in sports, trans people aren't assaulting women in the bathroom. It's all fear mongering, and nothing is ever new. It's just this recycled rhetoric of they're coming for the kids, they're pedos and groomers.
What is your response to that?
I think about how different my life would have been if I had grown up in a home where my expression would have been okay. Like, the things I remember expressing a desire for Barbies, and of course this is not necessarily like everyone's experience, and it's a little stereotypical, but I remember being drawn towards stereotypically feminine things, and as soon as I realized that was like not okay, I just ignored it, shoved it to the back of my mind. And what they're doing is they're forcing these children to go through the wrong puberty for them, and it's horrific. Like, all of the changes I saw when I started hormones, it was like fucking magical. Every day I would wake up and notice something, and I was happier, like every single day. And then I was able to have surgery on different aspects of myself. And every time I had surgery, I woke up like fucking ecstatic, because it was just such a like massive step for me. And like when I looked in the mirror, I was just so much happier. And so, to trying to imagine having to deal with the opposite of that, like, you know that you're trans, and you know that your body is about to start sending you in the wrong direction. I on one hand, I am grateful I didn't know before puberty, because I probably wouldn't have survived it. Because at this point in my life, if someone like forced me to take testosterone and to remasculinize, I would rather die. There is no world in which I exist comfortably and happy as a man. And forcing these children to go through the wrong puberty and to watch their bodies go in the wrong direction for them is just so cruel. But it's the conformity that is the goal. And it's just like the house that I grew up in, conformity is enforced, and they don't care who it hurts. They don't want anyone to step outside the lines. In the past, we used to have these laws called the Comstock laws, where like certain articles of clothing were considered male and certain articles were considered female. And in order not to break the law, you had to be wearing a certain number of articles of what was considered male, to offset if you were wearing like a number of articles that were considered female. Otherwise, you could literally go to jail. Like, a man or someone who's identified it, who the government as a man, could not just walk down the street in women's clothes. You would go to jail. And this is the direction that we're going again. Like, I spend entirely too much time on Twitter, and it's very unhealthy, especially since Elon Musk bought it. And I see this not insignificant number of people calling for things like, oh, women should not be allowed to wear yoga pants in public. That's indecent. It's just like nothing is ever new. It's literally just trying to go backwards. They yearn for this way that things used to be. The whole make America great again. Like, great again for who?
I noticed how you said every day you wake up, you're happier and happier. Did you struggle with mental health when you were younger? Looking back now?
It's difficult to use words like depression from when I was a child, because it was just like straight up not an option.
What do you mean by
I
that?
remember being unhappy and unfulfilled, but the way that my depression manifested as an adult, which was like this like lack of motivation or like lack of like energy, like that was not an option as a child. And so I literally pushed myself into school. I put all of my energy into that, because that was how I thought I was going to be happy, and that was how I thought I could make my family proud. But I definitely had anxiety. I remember having panic attacks, but not knowing what they were. I had these like very clear memories of standing there while I'm getting lectured, which is an experience I think most people have. Because like me getting in trouble was the end of my world at that point. That it was like I have disappointed my parents, and like my entire purpose for existing was to like make them proud. When I would fall short of that, and then I remember standing there being lectured, and I would get dizzy, and I would see spots And I was like, I'm about to I don't know what's happening, but like I'm about to pass out. And I was like, I need to sit down. And they would mock me for it, which I don't necessarily think that they were trying to be cruel. Like I didn't know what panic attacks were. They probably didn't either. And I was to an extent, I was a dramatic child. So I get it why they had the response that they did. But once I started seeing a therapist in college and we started talking about these experiences, I realized that I was having panic attacks as like a 12-year-old or 13-year-old. And so it makes sense that that's something that I've dealt with as an adult. It's not something that just happened.
I didn't start having panic attacks until I must have been like 16, 17 years old. And I don't know what it was like for you, but just that feeling of not being able to breathe, you feel like you're dying, like the air is getting sucked out of your lungs.
Literally, yeah.
And when nobody's there to really explain it to you or to help you understand what's going on, because I didn't really have, my parents were supportive, they were there, but when it came to mental health, I don't think anybody knew the right things to say or the right ways to react. And so I grew up just thinking after that happened that, oh, everybody experiences this. And that's just
Right.
not the case.
Yep, that's the main way that I describe it. And the main way that I experience anxiety still to this day is the feeling of not being able to inhale enough oxygen. It's like I can't catch my breath.
It's a
Thankfully, I have
scary,
not had, yeah, I haven't had a full blown anxiety or panic attack in probably 3 or 4 years. But yeah, as like a child, like not knowing what was happening. And it certainly makes sense, like looking back at it, because that was my entire world was based around making my parents proud of me. And so whenever I didn't do that, it was like everything came crashing down. And I just thought it was the end of the world. And it literally trained my brain to overreact to the like smallest problems. Or I read a really great book called The Body Keeps the Score. Have you read it or heard of it?
I actually had a guest on here and she is a trauma therapist. And that was one of the books that she recommended. So I've heard of
It
it, but I haven't read it.
it changed my life. Like it changed everything about the way that I think about my mental health, like why I am the way that I am. But basically, like your hypothalamus is like the smoke detector of your brain, and it determines if you're in danger or not. And so, experiencing certain things as a child can train your hypothalamus to have this like full blown like panic reaction to things that don't like necessitate it. Like evolutionarily, it's the kind of reaction that you would have if there was like a bear chasing you, and it would like give you the energy or whatever, like to run and survive. But instead, I'm having this reaction because of my parents are yelling at me, or as an adult, because it's, oh, I don't know how I'm gonna move across the country and start over with my entire life. And it just it trained my brain from a young age to have these severe overreactions that were just like shut me down.
What are some other common misconceptions about that you as a trans woman face on a daily basis? I know we talked about a couple of those things a little bit earlier, but from a personal perspective, what are the common misconceptions that most people have that obviously are not true?
Gosh, there is a lot of conflation of trans women with cross dressers. And I personally can't stand cross dressers. The difference between being trans and cross dressing is that, like, I identify as a woman. I am a woman. Like, I live my life as a woman. I know that, like, people can't see me, but, like, I pass. Like, almost nobody clocks me, which is nobody, like, looks at me and sees that I'm trans. Like, I have lived my life relatively normally for 4 or 5 years now. It was just that first year was a little awkward and uncomfortable. Whereas cross dressers, they shy's femininity and it has a sexual component to it. And so doing something like putting on pantyhose is like sexually gratifying for them. And they do it in secret. And with the increased acceptance of like trans people, there has been in my experience, like an increase in people publicly identifying as a crossdresser, which in itself is fine. However, the problem arises with the fact that at the end of the day, like these people are men. Crossdressers are men who they may dress up because they get like sexual kicks out of it, but at the end of the day, they take it off and they go to work as a man and they benefit from male privilege. And they don't speak for us. They don't speak for trans women. We don't have the same experiences. We don't have the same needs as a community. They're literally just men with a fetish. And so throughout the last like several decades, there has been a lot of conflation of trans women with cross dressers because of the similarities with wearing women's clothing. Not to mention that, like, whenever you're trying to figure yourself out, a lot of people have this experience of hiding, like dressing up in secret. Like, thankfully, with like me living in Austin, going to UT, like having a very supportive group of friends who also did drag and stuff, like I never had to deal with that. Everything I did about like my expression and like experimentation was like open, accepted, whatever. But a lot of people have this common experience of having to hide their desire to explore. And so with those like similar elements, there's this conflation with cross dressers. And so that's one common misconception. And I do find that they can be a bit predatory, especially like infiltrating the community, because at the end of the day, they're men. Like, you're socialized as a man, you live as a man, like you might put on a costume, but like you take it off at the end of the day. Yeah, that's why I say I don't cross dressers. Obviously, that doesn't apply to all of them, but it's enough of the community that it's like a common experience among trans women where like we don't feel safe with those kinds of people being allowed into our community. And so I am a little bit more on this like gatekeeping side of things as opposed to the everyone is valid, everyone. Like that's I think that for the safety of our community, like there has to be a certain amount of gatekeeping, other misconceptions. I think a lot of the stereotypes, it's like either people either think that trans women were like just hyper feminine gay men who like transitioned to trick straight guys, or they think the opposite, where it's like these predatory men who are trying to infiltrate women's spaces because they're like predators of women. It's always like one or the other extreme, and neither are accurate. Like, my life would have been a lot easier if I had been able to continue just living and existing as a gay man. Transitioning was a lot. Like, so it's not just like there's like a spectrum of gayness, and if you like reach one end, you like cross over into being trans. That's not how that works. Like, being your gender and like your sexual orientation are two entirely separate things. And so like I know a lot of trans women who are only attracted to men. I know a lot of trans women who are only attracted to women, and the vast majority of trans women are bisexual or pansexual. And we're just like trying to live normal lives. But because so much of our existence is either like sexualized, this is also part of the like the cross-dresser thing, because that's like a sexual thing for them that gets misapplied to the trans community, and they think that we're trying to force people to like participate in our fetish. Like, me existing as a woman has nothing to do with the fact that I'm attracted to men. What else? I'm trying to think what other common misconceptions. Gosh, I do live in a little bit of a bubble, so it's like hard to remember what other people think about us. Although Twitter does a good job of reminding me. Do you have other things that you've heard and like you're curious about? I would.
You actually touched on a lot of them. I think that leads into my next question, though, which is, to you, what is the value of being a woman? Or what would you say is the definition of a woman?
I feel like it's often presented as this gotcha question. And in the same way that there are disagreements on the definitions of things like racism, I think that there are a lot of different ways to define womanhood. But at the end of the day, I just want to be perceived as a woman by other people. And so obviously there are different cultural norms around womanhood, but any way that you try to draw these hard lines of this is or isn't a woman, there's always going to be exceptions and gray areas. If you want to say a woman is someone born with X chromosomes, that is true the vast majority of the time. However, there are a not insignificant number of people with chromosomal abnormalities, or I'm sure there's a more polite way to say it than abnormal, but and so that's not a hard and fast definition. You could say that a woman is someone who can bear a child. There are plenty of women who can't do that. And so at the end of the day, I'm less concerned or interested in trying to define womanhood as I am about doing what makes me comfortable and happy. And I don't think anything about what I've done to achieve that goal has infringed on anyone. I certainly like things like using a women's bathroom or like changing room. Yeah, I didn't immediately start doing that at the beginning of my transition. And I think that's like something that we need to deal with as a community of, okay, like when is it appropriate to start using the women's bathroom or changing rooms? But at this point in my transition, like I go to the gym 5 or 6 days a week. I don't change there because I live close to the gym, but I use the bathroom. Like I go to the locker room. I use the women's bathroom in public, and no one ever gives me like a second look. Like we're just trying to exist. And I think this trying to nail down the definition of what is a woman is like a counterproductive conversation. Because ultimately, I think that a world in which those lines are less clear is better for everyone, where people care less about, okay, you're a woman, so you have to look and act this way, or you're a man. Like that was a very rigid and uncomfortable world for a lot of people for a very long time. And those people's stories don't often get recorded or told. If you seek them out, there are always people living at the sort of the margins, and you can find those stories. Like it's a lot of people like to reference the Institute of like Sexology in Weimar Germany before the rise of the Nazis, and there were people taking cross-sex hormones in the 1920s and the 1930s at obviously in other places besides Germany, but specifically like this entire institute was about like studying and determining like what is the best course of action for these kinds of people, because people like us have always existed. And then it was shut down. It was actually one of the first targets of the Nazis. And like people get tired of the Nazi comparisons, but if the shoe fits, then lace it up. There was a contingent of the Republican Party that has such an outsized sorry, I am rambling entirely from the question you asked me, that has such an outsized voice, and like literally their entire goal is forcing people into boxes, and they are uncomfortable with the fact that we exist. And like I know that the Attorney General in Texas is making a list of people that have changed their gender marker. The governor of Florida is trying to get data from universities about their trans students. Like, why do they need these lists? Where do you think this is going? Like, fascism looks a lot of different ways. And like history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And staying in Texas would mean I would risk being forced off of hormones. And that is essentially a death sentence for me. I can't produce testosterone anymore. And so you have to have a dominant sex hormone to have like normal body functions, specifically around like your bones. So if I was forced to go off of estrogen right now, I would get osteoporosis within 10 years. I'm 28. Like I would be dead by 40. And so it is a death sentence. And forcing me to walk around with an M on my ID is just inviting like violence and discrimination. And it is fascism. There's no way around it. They're encouraging extrajudicial violence against our community by referring to us as groomers and pedos. And then they use that example. There was a shooter in Tennessee, I believe it was, that shot up a Christian school. And out of the literally hundreds to like thousands of like mass shootings that we have in this country, there's been less than a handful of people that supposedly identified as trans, but those people are held up as like representatives of our community and oh, we're dangerous.
I appreciate hearing everything that you have to say. So to have a different perspective, I think that's essential for any kind of peace in this world, because until you can see things from someone else's point of view, you can't ever really understand it. So I appreciate the story. I appreciate you rambling. I will never tell you to stop. Like that is the whole point of this show, is to share your story. So Never apologize for that. That's exactly what we're here to do. And like I said, I think the perspective is the most important thing.
Yeah. I'm like trying to approach it in a way that would like someone who has no idea they don't have any idea what's going on for like trans people in the community or in the country. I'm trying to approach it in a way that like explains the most like calculated method that contingents of the right wing in this country have taken to demonize our community. Like the first step to enacting violence against a group of like a community is dehumanization. It's not necessarily the first step, but it's an important one. Like first they create the other and then they demonize the other and then dehumanize. And if they succeed in equating being trans with being a pedo, like a groomer of children, a predator, then or like mentally ill. And that's with this shooter that I mentioned in Tennessee. I've seen calls specifically from like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other people of her, I don't know, that run in her ideological circles, say hormones are clearly making people aggressive and unwell and dangerous. And so for our own good, like they have to ban it. And oh, maybe people who are on hormone therapy shouldn't have access to guns, which is absolutely terrifying. Like, regardless of where you sit on the gun control debate, the idea of defining trans people as mentally deficient to the point that we shouldn't have access to guns is literally just trying to take away our ability to defend ourselves. Like, I grew up in Texas, I have guns. It's one of the only ways that I feel safe, like sitting in my home, knowing that if someone does try to enact violence against me because I'm trans and they happen to know where I live, specifically around me, like doing sex work, having a gun is one of the only ways that I feel safe and sleeping at night. And it's also proclaiming someone as like mentally deficient is one of the only ways that you can get around the Second Amendment and prevent them from owning guns. And so it's just seeing these steps play out in slow motion, but like in public. It's terrifying and it's hard to get people to take you seriously. At the end of the day, they are supporting state sanctioned and extrajudicial violence against our community. They are encouraging it, and legally, they don't want us to exist. They want to take away our ability to access hormones. They want to take away our ability to have correct documentation. And so there is a legal and a physical eradication across the country. And it's like I'm trying to live my life day to day with this like hanging over my head. I'm moving to another state that is supportive or is where I feel safe, but by some horrible twist of fate, a Republican wins in 2024 for the presidential election. The president has a lot of in regards to the way that like federal identification works. Like a Republican president could just decide that because my passport says female, that it's no longer accurate and they could cancel my passport. And then when I can't leave the country, they could decide to direct the FDA to decide that hormones are no longer to be used for transitioning. And then suddenly you can't access hormones in the entire country. Like escaping to a blue state isn't enough. But I can only focus on one thing at a time. And right now I'm focusing on getting out of Texas. If a Republican wins in 2024, then that's tomorrow's problem. I will deal with that when we get there. But yeah, that's what it's like existing as a trans person in a Republican state right now. And I scream on social, I tell people when it comes up in conversation, I try to explain like where we're at and I talk about it on social media. But there's just people are so tired of there's always something to be like outraged about.
As a society too, we've gotten pretty good. We don't That's why the news exists, is we cling to the negative components of life, just period. There's nothing headline worthy about a positive thing that's happening in
Right.
the world. And I think that's an underlying message in our society, is unless it's negative, it doesn't feel like people are going to care.
And it's the whole like views and clicks model.
Yes.
People get addicted, literally like their brains get addicted to the chemicals that are released whenever they get angry. And like this applied to me because I was very much a Facebook warrior for years. Like I would spend ungodly amounts of time and effort like arguing with people online. And I remember the sort of like sensation I would get whenever I somebody would respond, and then I would be like, oh, like I have to tell them about themselves and tell them that they're wrong. Your brain gets addicted to that feeling subconsciously. But it's also like they're literally trying to eradicate my community, and I don't know how to say that without sounding without either someone being like, oh yeah, that sucks, and then they go on about their like normal life while this is still happening. I don't know what I expect them to do, but I feel like there's just,
There's a
do you remember
complacency.
yeah, and I get it because it's like it's not affecting you. And I've certainly been in that position whenever it comes to like other communities. Like I remember whenever there was all of that coverage about during the Trump presidency of like immigrants being put in these like facilities and not having access to the bathrooms and like they're being separated from their children. And that stuff is like fucking horrible. But what was I going to do about it? But this is why when people say stuff like injustice anywhere is an injustice to everyone because they can, if it's not your community yet, there you will be next. But I think my frustration is I feel like there's this lack of leadership and around what exactly is happening and like how this is like such a, what's the word, like cohesive thought out plan around like, the way that they're attacking the trans community across the country. I'm sure you remember in the lead up to the years before the Obergefell decision that made same-sex marriage legal, there was all these campaigns, like there was like fuck hate, and it was just everywhere. I'm like, where is that for the trans community? Where is that kind of like constant, I don't know. I feel like legacy news is so committed to this both sides thing that they refuse to acknowledge that one side is literally trying to eradicate the other. Whereas, like with the same sex marriage debate, there was like less of that. And it was more cut and dry of these people just want to be able to get married and live normal lives. But because of the way that they approached, and because there's a lot more to being trans than just like you want to marry your partner, there's less of a cohesive sort of response. I feel like we don't like people's stories are not being like around. Like I can only imagine what it's like being someone who's trans and is under 18 right now, and living in a Republican state, like you have no power to just up and leave. You have to hope that your parents are supportive enough and have the means to take you to a different state.
And we talk a lot on this show about, or we have talked quite a bit about this idea that as humans, we're often scared of the things that we don't understand and the unknown and the fear. I think when you bring up the same sex marriage component of everything, there is some kind of understanding. Like for the most part, most people have understood this idea of love and what it feels like to be in love or to experience love. And so I think a lot of this comes down to people just don't understand. And so there's less compassion there. And that's not me
Right.
excusing it one way or another. But I think if people could just understand or be able to understand a bit more, which is again where that whole perspective thing comes in, then I think we would be living in a very different world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it too is that like almost everybody knows somebody that's gay or queer, just statistically. Almost everybody does. But the trans community is much smaller. And so not near as many people can say that they know a trans person. And people think, oh, you can always tell. It's like, that's confirmation bias. You have no idea how many trans people you interact with on a daily basis, and you don't know that they're trans. I'm not going to wear a fucking sign. I didn't shave the bones off my face so I could have people know, like walking around, people know that I'm trans. Like, I'm certainly, when I get out of the industry and I have a quote normal job, like, I'm not going to tell people. They don't need to know. It's none of their fucking business. It just invites like discrimination and people treating you differently. But obviously, like my close friends will always know.
As a closing question, I always like to ask this. I feel it's very interesting what a lot of people have to say in regards to the answer to this question. But if you could go back and you could speak to your younger self, what would you say?
Recently, I have spent a lot of time talking to my inner child.
Something we should all
So
do more of, I think, to be honest.
absolutely, yes. It was a really big step for me with my journey with therapy. It was like confronting and approaching my inner child and remembering like how I felt. But I think that the most impactful thing that I could tell my younger self is that you are worthy of love just the way you are. You don't have to do anything or be anything to make someone else happy or to make someone else proud of you. You are enough just the way that you are, and you deserve to be happy the way that whatever makes you happy.
I think that's a great message. I think that's a great message. Because a lot of us, and we spend pretty much our entire lives comparing ourselves to other people and looking outward for this validation that, and
Mhm.
having gone to therapy, this is also something that I think until you can sit with yourself, you can't really acknowledge that you're able to give all of those things to yourself that you've always looked externally for. And it's
Right.
fucking hard. It really is to be able to sit there and say, you know what? Like, what my dad thinks of me doesn't really matter. What my mom thinks of me doesn't really matter. What I think of myself and how I feel about myself is what matters. And
Mm.
even just saying that right now, like, obviously you value the opinions of the people in your life, whether it's a toxic ideology or not. You're always gonna,
Mhm.
to some extent, value or put emphasis on what the people around you think. But I agree that we all need to come to a place where you feel as though you are good enough on your own, because you're stuck with yourself for the rest of your life. And I have to remind myself of that all the time, that self-love is hard, but it's worth it at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I do so many meditations and like daily affirmations around self-love. It's been such a life-changing practice for me, and I just want that for so many people I know.
Yes, 100%.
Nicole LePera, how to do the work. Obviously, it's not going to fix everything in your life, but I there was a lot of stuff I took from that, especially with the inner child work and like meditations. Like that was where that came from for me. And so that one and Body Keeps the Score, cannot recommend those enough. But yes, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate your honesty and your bravery in being able to open up. I can imagine it's not a very easy thing, even being anonymous and all. Like, I applaud you for sharing your story. I really do.
Thanks for having me.